All right.
Okay, cool. We're in. Welcome, everybody, to Escaping the Echo Chamber or Escape the Echo Chamber. I'm not entirely sure we've decided on whether it's escaping or escape yet, but hey, that's part of the journey. Super excited for this next Echo Chamber. Sonita, our guest, has joined us very kindly to discuss the post HR generation. Are we moving past the Ulrich model? And if so, how? So, Sunita, please, for our audience and guests that obviously may not be aware of you, give us a quick intro, who you are, what you do. Over to you.
Sure thing. I'm American. I'm from the Midwest. That's between New York and LA. I originally, did not start out in HR. I actually started out in project management at an aerospace company, went to a VC fund for 6 years where I did venture development. And it was in that role where I got pulled into the field. So I think the nice thing about having that as a foundation and a background is my job for many, many years was being like the problem solver for different departments. I was never put in one department. I was kind of around in each of those roles to do different functions. And then at some point at the VC, something that kept coming up for our portfolio companies was, and we were pre-seed, so it was anything from a couple people to up to 80. Um, it was how do we hire? How do we keep people? What do we do? We don't really have HR. What is HR? And this was right around the time, like when I started out in the field, the big names were like Patty McCord, Tony Shea, where they were the only ones who were doing radical HR at that time. So there was a lot of time to be innovative. And actually, in 2015, I ended up going in house to one of our portfolio companies to lead the HR function. It was a small Series A renewable energy company. And there, because it wasn't software, it was hardware, and hardware is so not sexy. No one invests in it. And you get a founder waking up in the middle of the night and doing a design change, and you've got $500,000 of product coming from China that you can't use. So it's a very different risk environment. And you're very cash poor, so you have to manage your cash flows. So even though my background, I have an MBA, I studied business, at school, even though I had that business knowledge, doing a cash strapped startup that actually was moving goods was like a crash course in how businesses run and how interconnected everything is. So I came into HR with a pretty strong foundation. And then in 2017, I started working in Berlin, mostly at Berlin style VC backed VC funded startups, which has been under the grow at all costs model, which was totally shocking. There was so much money and you could do everything, and we didn't plan looking at money or anything that actually made sense. We were just living on dreams and free cash, which I think has pros and cons, and we're all kind of dealing with the hangover of right now. So that's my background.
Amazing.
Um, I'm married to a Dutch person, which explains why the last name makes no sense. Now it makes sense. Sometimes that comes up. But my passion personally, and also as part of my studies, was always cross-cultural management and this like deep fascination for how groups of different people can come together and get along, do something amazing. Like that's what just gets me up in the morning. And that's what's getting me up
Amazing.
tomorrow to make, 10 kilos of turkey for a bunch of people, is just bringing
Yes, of
different
course.
people together and just celebrating and feeling this connectedness.
That's amazing. And that brings us neatly just to the cusp of this echo chamber. But before we jump into that, I think it's only right to bring in my co host and um, one of the top 10 influential people leaders in Europe, Matthias.
And the only one with a picture that's not in a black hoodie. You took the white hoodie to be the outlier.
Yeah,
Loved it.
exactly that. Exactly that. So, Matthias, just give us a little bit of context in terms of this echo chamber. What are we attempting to achieve with this one?
Yeah, no, 100%. First of all, thank you for the wonderful intro and my recognition. I don't know. So, look, I think this echo chamber, I high likely see already to be multiple episodes as well. It has definitely the potential. And I do think that we talk about, do we need to rethink HR and people practices? Yeah. A lot of people tell us this. It's especially McKinsey, of course. McKinsey tells us a lot of things these days. And particularly, we need to rethink HR. We have other articles like Forbes, but we also have conferences that say rethink HR or rethink people, right? Or have a different approach to the people topic. We also have books about it, right? I just, in my preparation of this echo chamber episode, we're looking at Lars Schmidt, Redefining HR, the book that he wrote, but also looked at Jessica Swan. I think she also had a book out that was talking about introducing product principles into the HR space and leveraging this. And so, it's a lot of noise around there, around this topic. And I would love to talk with all of you today about, first of all, why do we think we need to really change? Is this another sales pitch? Or is it just because people don't understand how you do good HR and that's why they force you to rethink it because they suck in how to do it or they don't know it? I don't know, Glenn. So let's explore this a bit further.
Well, exactly that. And I think that's a really great tee up as to why Sonita is an amazing guest for this. Sonita and I met more recently at the PX Espresso event, which is post HR generation. So she is part of that community of thinkers that are thinking beyond the Ulrich model, which is our echo chamber. This is how HR is done. This is how HR has always been done. And actually, it's a really successful model to a degree. Why change? So, Sunita actually is a really nice segue into your thoughts around the kind of HR transformation.
Mm.
What kind of drew you to that kind of people first product led community? Because you've got, as you've explained at the top of the show, you've got an extensive background in people and talent, right? So what started to pique your interest around this different modal way of working within HR?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at like in my intro, I said this as well. There's this multi experience background. Um, I think whenever I do something new, regardless of if it's in my personal life or it's professionally, I think there's this, and I just started this new job a couple weeks ago, so I'm thinking about this concept of a lot of when does experience make you wise and when does experience make you stupid? Um, and what I mean by that is, I feel like sometimes when you're experienced and you've done something successfully over and over again, you want to keep doing it the way you've done it. And that's not necessarily relevant in all contexts and all environments. So the reason why I still continue to look for different ways of thinking is I want to check myself against what I know, what I think I know, what I know I don't know, and what I'm not sure I don't know yet. And that's why I gravitate towards that, because you want to hear, like, all right, how are other people doing this? Do I want to do that in my environment? What I think is dangerous, regardless of what model you use, and I'm sure some of you have, both of you or people listening have had the founder who got up, did their 5 o'clock workout and 5 kilo run, read HBR, saw some model, and have told you now that you need to launch that model in the organization. And I don't care what model you have, not all models fit all environments and all cultures. So, not just the sort of how things work, like the flow of information, the flow of work in general, but also the culture of the organization. So, I think all those things kind of need to be taken into account. And that's where I landed in just continuing. I've read this great expression. It's called, I'm a knowledge glutton. So this concept that you consume more knowledge than you can actually process at any given time, which in and of itself, I think is not true. Like, I think you can consume as much knowledge as you want, and then you never really know when the knowledge becomes useful. But that's open for debate. Yeah, that's how I ended up there, to just continue to test my assumptions and continue to see if I should add new experiments to my toolkit.
Very cool.
So let's maybe get started with something that, you know, is very obvious when you practice people, or when you work on people practices, you try to implement them, you make them work, you have this on daily uh, as a daily task for all of us. I think, why would you say, Sunita, are executives so obsessed? You mentioned this wonderful story of like they wake up in the morning at 5 a.m. and they be like they have read an article, right? And they say you need to do it exactly like this. Like, why are they so obsessed? Sometimes this is at least my experience with administrative
Mhm.
HR. Why do they say, well, people operations, that's all we need, nothing else, you know, this keeps the organization running? What is your experience why executives think that way?
I think everybody wants a silver bullet, right? They want to do something that's known, and anyone who's worked with people knows that they're completely unpredictable. Like, you can't
Mhm.
plan. I mean, I remember one of the companies, a Series B that I started at a couple years ago, and had someone running office management who had worked at a Sparkasse, which is a very traditional, very, very, very traditional German bank. And something had happened, and he was like, we need to make a policy and we need to write all this stuff down, and we need to prepare ourselves so something like this never happens again. And I think people want to create something that protects them from future risk. And the
Mm.
reality is there is no thing that you can protect yourself, you can create that will protect yourself from future risk outside of changing people's behavior, right? Because if you write down a perfect policy, but then things are happening really ad hoc, and everyone who comes in looks around, sees things are happening ad hoc, no one actually sits, it's those policies turn into pages and pages and pages of Notion or Confluence or whatever you're using to share information in your company. And no one actually reads all of those sort of safety mechanisms put in place. And so you have to make sure that when you're rolling anything out, that you're rolling it out not just on paper, but in folklore, I would almost say, like where
Mhm.
you have people who understood the problem with you, who you brought along with you on the journey, um, who understood why you built what you built and are with you, so that when they're at the coffee maker, or when they're doing a donut chat if you're fully remote, and they're like, God, did you see that weird thing yeah, no, they tested it on our department, they did it because this and this. Like, people understand your cause. So I think there's almost this, I'm a mom, so that doesn't sound relevant, but Matthias knows me, I tell stories and it sounds irrelevant at first, and I'll bring it back full circle. But there's a certain degree of socialization. So you make a new rule, and then there's a certain degree of obligation of whatever rule you make, you have to socialize your peoples until it becomes practice. So that when new people come in, those people are socialized. Oh, we don't do it like that here. We don't do it like that here because of this. They probably aren't going to send someone to the Confluence page, but they learn by watching others. They learn by having someone pull them aside and be like, hey, we don't do that here. Um, and I think that's where the disconnect is. On paper, everything's clean. It's easy to share. It feels absolute. People feel safe. It's black and white. But actual people and groups of people are gray. And we don't, we can't do that black white distinction. And I think if you want to be in this field and you want to be successful, being in the gray is the job. Now, that being said, I do think the Ulrich model, in terms of how it's segmented in terms of work, makes sense in that I always felt like my business partners, their job was literally operating in gray. They didn't get to do black white work. That's not the job. Everything's gray, and you need to kind of try to keep it in the center as best as possible. But it's very rare that you're going to have things that are black white on an everyday basis. People operations, most people who go into that function, you need those people to be black white. Payroll has to go out on time. Contracts have to be in the right folder when you get audited. Sorry, like I'd love to not have to do that shit, but the lights have to stay on and people have to get paid.
Mm.
The moment that falls apart, like doesn't matter how nice your culture is, people turn mean real fast. And then you need the people who work in talent acquisition. They have to have thick skin, and they have to be willing to be told no over and over and over again and not really care that much. And I think that segmentation makes sense for the types of people that go into it. Where I don't agree with the Ulrich model is where, I don't know, you have like too small of a team and then it's just ridiculous to segment it. People have to do the actual work. Great example, Ulrich model in a company, my company's size is almost silly because we're 130 people. But what I can't have is I can't have one person in one role and then they go on vacation or they have a sick kid and no one knows how to do that work. So I think the expanding the roles and responsibility to a wider scope where there's some more overlap between TA and the business partners, or more overlap between what is traditionally business partners and people ops. I think or even office management people ops is another one where you see a lot of overlap. I think it's important that multiple people are cross trained. And I think that's what we've really been missing for a long time. That isn't a new concept, but is quite old, right? This job sharing, people coming in, maybe knowing how to do 20, 30% of someone's job so that when the inflow of work to do gets so high that one person can't do it, instead of bringing in more people, you have to expand that and be able to take it into new focuses. So my last series B had people partners all had to hire one person a quarter
Mm.
to stay fresh, which I liked doing because, then they had to still, they knew they had the skills to do it. They knew the teams already. They knew the stakeholders already. And it also forced them to stay pretty fresh with what's going on in the departments and what's going on in the markets, right? So the people that we're talking to, are we calling these people senior and they're nothing compared to what the market is telling us? I thought it was really, really good to do that way. So I think that's something that we need to bring back.
But Sunita, you said then back to the question is the reason why executives want to are in love with the administrative or people ops work is because they believe they have control over policies and documents. That gives them control because they are maybe unaware that they cannot control people or you cannot control behaviors, right? Is that the
I think it's
direction where
measurable,
you want?
right? Like
Yeah,
executives
yeah,
they want KPIs. They want to be able to be like, well, we put this much money into this, and then we
yeah,
saw our headcount double. We saw our ENPS score go up, or, the thing is with ENPS is it's one question and m- you know, it doesn't really show you the why as much.
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, I think that people feel safer when they have black white things that they can look at, when they can say, I did this the right way, I've benchmarked it, I've read everything about it, and you roll it out. The thing is people are more complicated than giving them the perfect document.
I think you
So
make an
that's where,
interesting point, Sonita.
yeah, that's where I like the product. I like, regardless of what model you use, you have to do some you have to do some of the product stuff. You have to do a minimum viable product. That's just good business. It doesn't matter what, I mean,
Mm.
if we just strip everything away, if I think I'm a business person, I'm selling a service inside this organization, do people like what I do? Do they come back to even before product, this would have been the case. People come to my house to eat my 7-layer dip. I make a really good 7-layer dip. I get invited to parties because my 7-layer dip. Like, if you do something good, they come back for more. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's cooking or you're selling a
Yeah.
product or opening a restaurant or you're doing people's stuff. Like I think we've what we've been doing it, people have been creating value since the beginning of people, and
Mm.
exchanging that value with others since the beginning of people. And I think that's where, yeah, some of these concepts feel new. They're just called new things.
Yeah, 100%. I think you make a couple of really interesting points in so much as the Ulrich model is very much around process engineering. It's kind of a framework for companies to kind of implement very quickly. It's known, it's stress tested. But actually, when you think about when it was written and kind of documented, there wasn't really a kind of burgeoning kind of startup ecosystem then, right? It was kind of, if I remember correctly, the date timelines. I mean, it was definitely pre some of the kind of unicorn startups that we now see and kind of are now the new benchmark. So you kind of think to yourself, well, actually, if kind of the workplace and certainly that startup scale up workspace has changed and evolved is very different to your traditional kind of corporate environment, then surely there is the requirement for a new model.
So
And I
there's a
think this is indicated to agree in the fact that startups actually almost engage HR when they're at a certain point, like 20 in,
Mhm.
30 in, 40 headcount. So there was already probably an indication that there was a gap and window for a slightly different approach. Would you say? What's your thinking on that?
there's a really good German word for this, which is Jein, which means yes and no, have like they get squished together. So Ulrich model came out in 97, I believe. This was right during the dot-com boom, which was the first time we saw startups just money throwing in, ramp up, and then
Mm,
bust, I think, early of the 2000s. So it overlaps with another concept, which I think is worth bringing up, which is the way that work changes dramatically. So if you think about industrial revolution, we've had three. So we had the invention of steam, which replaced horses, the invention of electricity, which replaced steam, and then we had computers, which changed the way that people worked. And then arguably people say that we are now, and this is from an Atlantic article. I can send it for the references later on. I can't remember what it's called, and it makes me really think that now we have access to different tools, but people will continue to evolve based on the tools they have available to them. Now, to your point, I think some of this stuff, I think HR was invented because factories needed to have people come back into work and they could not plan with how often people were absent. And so it was a business decision. So they created a department to listen to people's needs, to make sure that they felt taken care of, and so that they could come back in and actually do work and the business could run. I think that this reinventing, I think, almost has gotten us into a bit of a pickle in that we don't look at was what was done before because we think it's irrelevant. But I think that if you look back even 50 or 60 years ago, my grandpa worked at a bank. He worked at the bank his whole life. He went from being entry level to running a regional bank and I think multiple banks in that region. He retired at 65 and that bank took care of him from basically life to death. And then now some of the stuff that we saw Google do, it's not, is it really that far from that? Or is that just recycling an old idea of we want the people to stay here and be engaged and work as hard as possible. Let's give them everything that they need in their life. And this is where I think that we get a little bit arrogant in the field with this recreation because it means because we're saying we're reinventing it, sometimes we don't even go back to the basics and think, you know what, maybe there is use to this. I'm not maybe I don't need to thought lead. Maybe I need to take some old ideas and see how these were solved in the old days. Great example of this is Jessica referenced the Peter Principle. And I only know about the Peter Principle because my dad was born in 1947. So the Peters Principle was around 1968, 1969. And the idea was that everyone professionally would rise to the level of incompetence because you would continue to be promoted, promoted, promoted until at one point you're promoted with tasks so great that you can't learn how to do them fast enough to be relevant, and your competence turns to incompetence. And that is such a, and Jess mentioned this, and I don't know if you were there when she had that did that presentation on it, and I think I was the only one who raised my hand, and I wouldn't have known it, but I was in a startup at the time, and I was telling my dad about what I was working on. Like, oh yeah, yeah, the Peters principle. Everyone rises to their level of incompetence. And so there's some of these nuggets that we've seen over time that I think would be good to try again, especially now that we're in a time where money is not free and everyone's thinking about humans as resources again.
Hmm.
Yeah, interesting. I think I would challenge you on I think the economic climate has probably informed our, companies' thought processes around their kind of people now. So I think that has been as a result of, obviously subsequent two recessions and a global pandemic. So I think that perhaps the leadership team are now almost being forced to think and frame kind of their workforce in a slightly different way. Doesn't mean to say they have to. So I still think
Yeah.
there's a choice in there. And I think the piece for me really is around, and I do take your point. I think some of the kind of historic frameworks really are still very relevant. Of course, they're relevant because there hasn't been a huge, massive shift in the way that kind of companies are put together. There's still hierarchy, there's still kind of leaders, there's still middle management, there's still people doing the work and stuff like that. So I still think some of these frameworks are very relevant. I guess it's, where are we? Where do you think we are on this journey of kind of evolution? Not major change. I think it's evolution. I think it's an evolution of how we think about people in the workplace, what their need is, and what our responsibility is as a leadership team and business to continue to create a platform and environment for them to be productive. Where do you think we are on that kind of journey? Are we at a tipping point? Are we still kind of analysis paralysis? Are there kind of green shoots of change? What's your take, your sentiment on that?
I think we're at the beginning because we have a couple things that are very, very real right now that did not exist 20 years ago. One, we have AI and it's changing. I mean, everything from I remember that one of my forums that I'm part of, they had shared an article about a cybersecurity company. I work at a cybersecurity company now, accidentally hiring an AI person, like a not real person to work remotely. And so this is how advanced the tech is getting. So that technology is not just evolving outside of our ability to use it out of the gate to even understand how we could use it yet. I think this is the quite real thing. Another very, very real thing, and I believe the statistic is around 40% of the next generation coming into the workforce has depression and anxiety. And this is something that we've never seen before, right? And I sat next to I don't know if you Matthias is going to laugh, but I like to talk to strangers. It's a hobby of mine. So I was talking to a stranger on the plane, and he was telling me, he's like, "Yeah, I actually work for the NHS in the UK." And he
Hmm.
said, I think it was actually on the way back from that conference, and he said, I was
Yeah,
like, "Oh yeah,
sure.
what do you do?" And he was a psychiatrist. I said, "I heard that this next generation really has a lot of depression." He said that for the people that were in their last 2 years of high school, first 2 years of university during the pandemic, that your brain is still forming. And that is a time where your brain should be forming and you have maximum hope. He said it's not just that it's at that high level, the 35, 40%, it's also that the ratio of that cohort of people with extreme cases is higher than any other cohort he's ever seen. So I think
Wow.
we're going to see the mental health piece become important, not just for our workforces, but just societally. As like, I don't think we've had a generation where 40% were suffering from anxiety and depression and extreme anxiety and then depression. He said that it was the ratio of what would normally be like manageable versus very extreme was very, very high in that group. And that was hard to hear and hard to think about because I'm raising two Gen Zers basically. I think one's a Gen Z, one's a Gen Alpha. I'll have to figure out which slang they've taught me to indicate it.
Love it. We talked also quickly about the value add. Like,
Hmm.
what should be the value add of people teams? Maybe we can start with this because I think when you talked about the revolutions and why it started and where we are now, mm, for me, it always comes up this problem with the value add concept
Hmm.
is like, are people leaders real business leaders? Do they understand that part of their job is also to build successful companies, of course, with the business leaders together? But like from your take, Sunita, and then also I would leave this up for Glenn as well to say
Hmm.
something about it. It's like, what should be the real value add? And maybe the value add wasn't clear
Hmm.
for people in this space, which led to maybe not building the right practices, or not implementing the right practices because of that misunderstanding what they really are there for.
I think there's two types of strategy that come up in HR. There's how do we build HR so that we aren't incompliant, which is necessary, but not what I would argue is a business strategy. I mean, it is if you're going to get audited and you have to pay a lot. But in terms of like proper business function strategy is where are we going and how does my function affect that? An example is I work in a cybersecurity company. I'm learning about the business right now. We sell cybersecurity as a software. We make sure that you're protected from inbound threats. We also have a product that I'm not trying to do a sales pitch, but this is how much I like my company. We also have a product that also checks, and it checks me. I was like, oh my God, we got Adobe. I'm so happy. And I clicked on it, and they're like, you have clicked on a cybersecurity threat. So they test it on us all the time. And then the third one is insurance. So you
Wicked.
have like three arms. Basically, anyways, you have these three different areas of the business: cybersecurity and cybersecurity aware, which is this one where I'm saying that you're checking internally for your people, and if they're accidentally going down a rabbit hole that could lead you to attack. Um, and that's squarely in the tech space, like that's squarely in SaaS. But then you have this insurance arm. So if you have those two products, you can get insurance because our product works. Everybody's from X Central Intelligence from the Netherlands. So the insurance companies will underwrite companies at a lower monthly rate than they normally would because insurance companies don't know how to assess if someone's company is at risk for being attacked. So they finally have a definite way to say that, and then they get a better premium. So the point is, when I hear that, I'm like, oh shit, how are we going to hire people who sell to brokers? Right? Because we know SaaS, we know how to hire for tech. I've done that. But when you hire for brokers, those are all about building around relationships. So then you bring in this different level of we also have to build infrastructure for new talent that we then train to do broker sales and interact with brokers and make sure that they're able to educate brokers. So that's the kind of strategy where I mean that if you didn't take the time to understand the business, understand, well, how much are we supposed to be selling through the broker channels versus what we sell directly to companies and their IT folks, because those are very, very, very different business models, right? And that's where I think a lot of HR people get tripped up. They have to be interested in the wider business because if you're thinking about what the business is supposed to have achieved in 18 months, and if it's something like my case where it's a big chunk should probably come from that other area, not just what our core has been, the cybersecurity piece, we have to completely change the way we do talent acquisition, but also growth internally, right? So we're going to have to start a leadership program for young folks. We're going to have to train people to do broker skills. It's sales from a technical perspective. Like no one exists like that who can sell cybersecurity to insurance agents. Like I think that's
Mm.
quite interesting, right? So I have to think about how I staff my organization where they meet two very, very different models. And that means now, as I build out my team, I also have to build out my team to be flexible to this tech startup model. But insurance is a very different beast.
Mm.
Um, so, back to your point, like, how do you add value? You add value by understanding what is a win for the wider organization and what is within your scope of control that will move the organization closer to that win. At minimum on time, preferably faster. That you're able to have conversations with people about their challenges that aren't just about textbook things, but also about how people problems could turn into sales problems, for example. like
Yeah.
not being able to hire someone because they don't exist and you have to grow them. So then do we need to revisit our targets? Stuff like that. And I think this concept of adding value, you can add value with little experience because you provide a perspective that's meaningful to the person you're engaging with. And I think that's something that HR folks should always keep in mind. It doesn't matter that you know everything about the business, but you should at minimum be able to ask questions until you understand it and understand what you do that fits into that model. To be going back to my lecture about the early models. I remember my first startup, I pulled a model called the balanced scorecard. Do you know the balanced scorecard?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
it's such an oldie but goldie, because if you sit down in a team and everybody says, all right, we want to make this amount, and then you go through like, what do we need financially? What do we need people wise? What do we need technology wise? What do we have to get from the sales team? And all of that stuff funneling in, you start to map out your interdependencies on each other. And then it's almost impossible to say that the people function is not strategic or relevant, because
Mhm.
it almost always comes back to getting the right people in at the right time to be able to create the right product at the right time so that the sales can sell it to the customers and get it to them at the right time so that we can get money in and buy more people and then start the cycle again.
Yeah.
100%. And
Then.
just to kind of tag on to that, Matthias, Sunita made a key distinction there, which is, as a leader, she's thinking of talent as a strategic function. She's not thinking of it as a service function.
Oh
And to
yeah.
your point around, how do we add value? We add value by the context with which we're brought in. If we're brought in from a talent
Mm,
perspective as a service just to provide a pipeline of talent, that's pretty much what we're going to do. If we're brought in from a strategic perspective and there's thought processes around, okay, talent in terms of, okay, if we're bringing people in to nurture them, move them in, retraining, etc., it's really how talent is looked at and viewed from that business perspective. And you need leaders like Sonita to really advocate for the strategic approach to talent to really add value. Otherwise, you're only going to be judged on time to hire, fill
mhm,
ratios, etc. And that's just the traditional kind of recruitment model. That's not talent in my mind. That's recruitment. That's sourcing and
mm,
recruitment. Talent is more to what Sunita's talking about, around that kind of strategic thought process around,
yeah,
kind of obviously the talent we've got internally. How do we nurture? How do we train? What talent do we need in terms of kind of planning more, kind of forecasting and
yeah,
understanding that landscape. So for me, it's almost like, what does your leadership want, and what environment are they going to set up for you to, what do they want from talent? And if it's just quite literally a transactional recruitment sourcing, that's pretty much all you're going to be allowed to do. Naturally, for me, I prefer to sit in the camp in the world where Sunita's thinking
mhm,
about talent as a more strategic function.
yeah. But I mean, it's almost like if you think of it like a race car, like if you want to give someone a race car, you have to make sure the engine runs and it runs well. And
Mm,
I think when you start,
mm,
those metrics are all really important, right? Like you want to make sure your engine's running and you can check and see when something's off, and then you have your numbers to go back and have difficult conversations with difficult stakeholders. I 100% believe in knowing your numbers and building your dashboards so that you can have meaningful conversations. Um, but you should also be able to have meaningful conversations about your function, regardless of what function it is and how it fits into a bigger picture and why it's relevant.
yeah.
Mm.
A question to both of you, and it kind of leans into this, okay, the kind of post HR generation kind of community, which is quite small, and I don't know if everybody's listening is aware of it, but actually it's about reframing your employees as not, kind of almost like pieces of your puzzle and engine and about their productivity. It's about thinking of them as customers. And
Mm-hmm.
Sunita and Matthias, what do you think? How do you think leaders need to shift their mindset to adopt that approach of employees as customers? Is it a big mindset shift, or is it just a simple kind of reframing of how they view their employees? I'd be curious just to kind of touch upon that just to begin with. I guess my question is, are we asking them to really make a massive leap in terms of the way that they view their employees? Or is this just a simple mindset shift which can add a real, a lot of value quite quickly?
Yeah, for me, honestly, if I want to start this office, it's the mindset shift for me, honestly, because when I look at leaders and leaders from different generations, or different age groups or age cohorts, you see that this very top-down approach, like, hey, I do this and I tell you what to do, and stop thinking, just focus on execution. I think this is something which, over the years to come, and maybe even in the beginning, yeah, was something that, I don't know if that was ever efficient, but it was common practice in a lot of these organizations, and they work quite well with this approach. But I do think that we entered a new era where people want to be part of the decision making. People want
Hmm.
to be asked for. People have the urge of co-creation as well, right? If there is a boss that still says, "Look, I'm the smartest person in the room, and I would tell you all that you need to do it exactly like this." I mean, honestly, no wonder then you have your AI agents and work with your AI agents and don't hire humans, and that's it, right? I mean, look at this. This is not how the world works, right? So I think this is a little bit where this topic of treating people also as customers comes
Hmm.
in. This is also where different leadership styles come in. This is also where you created psychological safety comes
Hmm.
in. This is where it comes in. What does high performance mean, and
Hmm.
what does high performance as a team mean, but also as an organization? Yeah, talking about talent density. Everybody's talking about talent density, but first of all, it costs you a huge amount of money.
Hmm.
Second of all, having a lot of high performers in a company can create a toxic
Yeah,
work culture.
that's true.
Everybody is like, no, if we have everywhere high performers, everything is okay. No, it's not. Trust me. So, I think this is something that I see that we are struggling with, that leaders need to adapt their leadership style and their mindset to the world right now, to the way they need to literally never stop learning. And I
Hmm.
think this is the biggest problem. I have seen a lot of people who were successful, they've been raised, they've been educated, they've been socialized with a certain way of leading, and they never adapted, and that's something that makes them literally be fading out, and not being part of the leadership generation that we actually need to build successful companies. And I think this is where also HR or people practices add value, to keep leaders, like help them to evolve, coach, and enable to be the leaders they need to be in order to be successful in companies. And we all know last sentence is that leaders are playing a key critical role, because
Hmm.
it's productivity, it's culture. They are it's a multiplicator of so many things, right? And if the leader is not working well, everything else falls apart in certain areas. So I think this is where I would start.
I, I think this customer model is more giving leaders something that they can understand and why it matters to them more than I necessarily prescribe to, I don't know, the we are running products and they subscribe to our products by coming back to work. I think people come to work still largely to feel connection. And I think that this concept of quality connection, coming someplace and being able to feel like you belong there. It's been something that I think companies, I mean, full disclosure, I did my master's thesis on Malaysia on cross-cultural management. And even back then, Malaysia is a multicultural society with Malays, Muslim Malays. It's under Sharia law, so there's not as much integrating as other countries. Muslim Malays are the dominant population, Indians and Chinese, and that you'd have these huge factories. Hewlett Packard, L'Oreal would manufacture there, and so corporates during the early 2000s were trying to figure out how do we create a great environment where people want to come in here and work. And I think that's where the customer framework helps because no one's going to be like, well, I don't care about customers. Why do I care about them? Like it it gives a different level of seriousness. But for me, and maybe this is just my whole lifelong quest of understanding how groups of people can come together and accomplish something together. um, I think it's getting as many people as possible feeling like they're part of something and that the work that
Mm.
they do matters. Whether you call it treating them like customers, or whether you call it building tribes, which I think was a big thing in the
Mm.
2000s.
Oh yeah.
Whether you give it some weird name like Proctoids, which I thought was the worst. Procter and Gamble calls themselves Proctoids, or used to back then. But where you create an environment where people feel like they can go there and that they belong there, I think will always be something that's the goal. And whether the tool is a customer model or someone else's model, I think it's whatever language we need to use to get managers to take it seriously so that they're cultivating environments that people want to be in.
Really interesting, because I think your point there around kind of the product approach, I think it does give a reference point and a framework, but ultimately we buy products, one, because either they're functional, or two, because there is a values alignment or value alignment there,
Mm,
right? So it's kind of, it swings back to this point around, kind of values based cultures. And actually the product on the outside could be, oh, okay, the product is the value of collaboration. That's what buys you in. When you use the product or engage with the product, if it doesn't give you that sense of collaboration, then immediately you're not bought in. So then the next level for companies is really, okay, if you're saying collaboration is your value in your product, people need to experience that. That needs to be a
yeah,
lived experience, and something that's kind of something that they can feel, engage with, be part of. So perhaps when we talk about the kind of productization piece here, actually we're moving more towards, okay, if we're saying the product is a value and the value is something that really inherently resonates with people, that needs to be a lived experience within that particular business for it to be real, and for it to be a kind of retention tool. So maybe we are coming back to this kind of values based culture, and actually really having to concentrate and think about, is this who we are?
yeah,
We're saying this, it's on the website, it's part of the hiring process, we're interviewing people based on these values. But is this genuinely what we are? And I still feel there's this, I don't know, just kind of, there's no, to your point, there's no silver bullet on values based hiring. And, kind of, there are companies with good cultures, but I don't think there's a blueprint where everybody goes, okay, if we adopt that, we're going to get it right. Because ultimately, it requires that human interaction. And as you said at the kind of top, you can't control human beings and how they feel
no,
about things.
no. And that's why I think that's why you asked how I ended up at the PX Expresso. I also followed Jubu, and I like her. The way that she puts it is wonderful. We all need to pretend to be scientists. We need to be scientists. And I think if I'm honest, that's how I ended up at the VC. That's how I ended up in HR. I wanted to achieve something, and I would have an idea of kind of where I was going. I wasn't committed on how I was going to get there. I'd experiment, I'd check with people, I'd see if it worked, if it had the intended outcome. I'd make revisions and then I'd try it again. And at that point, in that process of experimentation, it's easier to build promoters for what you're doing because they were part of building it with you. Another really great old study, and I've never been able to find it again, is there was this study on what led to desegregation in the United States, around the roots of it being World War II. And that World War II was the first time that mixed Americans from different classes, different races had to go and be in a situation and literally rely on each other for life or death. And so over time, when those veterans came back and desegregation, the racial riots started to happen, there were a lot more people who were like, I worked alongside of someone who was a different class or a different race from me, and they had a different level of empathy for it because they had trusted them in that intense environment. Anytime that you put different groups of each people together to work on something meaningful, they tend to put their differences aside and focus on the task at hand. And that's been over time and history one of the ways to break down some of those bigger barriers that we've seen. And I think it will be part of going forward, whatever the next big revolution is that whatever we build, we need to be doing it alongside of not only the people that are using it, but the people that it'll affect.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I love that example because it's a horrible thing that happened that had interesting consequences later on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of it sounds fascinating. I mean, if you could find that, we'd love to be able to we'd love to be able to share that with the
I
audience.
know I
It's kind
will
of
look
it
for
sounds
it.
immediately. I was bought in. I was like, wow.
I think it was in honestly in my studies that I had dug it up because it was like, well, how did you do cross culture? How do we do cross cultural management before? And like what other examples were there of like what reduced barriers? And a lot of these are old principles, you need to have a mission that people can subscribe to. You need to have something written down or some way that it's communicated how we do work here and what are the norms here in this new culture. It's the same thing in Germany. Like I live in Germany. I have American children and I talk to strangers in the grocery store. And sometimes I talk to American strangers in the grocery store. And whenever you talk to Americans in a grocery store whose kids have been living here a long time, either my kids or their kids are like, Mom, do you know her? Why is she talking to you? Because it's just not done here. And then I always turn to
Mm.
my kids and I say, We're American. We talk to strangers in the grocery store. That's how it's done in America. And so there's these cultural things that get passed down, and in companies
Yeah.
that should be passed down in the documents, but it ends up really not the documents. It is what Matthias said. It's the leaders.
Yeah.
It's the leaders
Yeah.
saying, hey, that's not how we do things
Yeah.
here. We don't talk to
Yeah.
strangers in the grocery store at this company.
Yeah.
But when you
Or in
go
the
when you
kitchen.
go on an
Or
overseas assignment to America, you have to talk to strangers in the grocery store.
yeah. No, I love this because honestly, this whole cultural dimension, I think, is so much when we talk about technology and data and new approaches and principles and so on. We kind of tend to lack and forget about the cultural part, right? And especially when you talk about how is your executive team set up, or how our senior leaders are set up, this is probably hiring the right person in one of those positions is probably the biggest culture campaign that you can drive going forward. And that puts a lot of pressure now to the TA folks that are probably listen to this, because I mean, in the end of this is really, really important that leaders or founders also tend to forget, right? They are the ones that are shaping culture. Yeah. And this is something that I can clearly see when you understand the executive team of any company good or very well, you understand what kind of culture they have. Yeah.
And that's why you need to know their business inside and out. That's why you need to say
Yes.
and to be fair, I've only been at my company a short amount of time. I have an extremely competent director of talent. And she already told them, she's like, if we can't hire for this role, we have to build this role. We need a program. And
Yeah.
she's in our space, she's operating in the full scope of talent where she's also doing talent development. And I think in this case it makes sense because
Yeah.
I think in most startups, talent should have the whole arm of talent development because in a lot of these startups, you have a lot of folks that came with you through Series A, through Series B, through Series C. They end up being at 200 folks, and then the bar for the people you bring in is different than the bar that you kept managers accountable for. So the goal
Yes.
is because then basically by bringing in a lot of folks from the market, you made the Peters principle way steeper than it should have been, right? They weren't
Yeah.
competent and they wouldn't have been competent if they had stayed at a company that grew 10% year over year. And but the moment you bring people in with skills that they didn't have, accounting for the growth that you were having, developing them at the growth you were having, that's why I think it's very smart to keep talent over that arm, especially in scaling startups, because they have a very good understanding of who you have and who they're being compared against in the market and how
Mhm.
big the gap is that you need to worry about. So, I mean, that's one where I think from an org design standpoint, depending on what you're doing and what stage you are at, it does make sense to to lump the development piece and some of the performance piece a little bit with the talent team.
Couldn't
So
agree more.
to to close, the closing question for both of you, starting with you, Sonita. If we're saying that we are on this journey of kind of change and evolution within HR, what one, two, or three things do we need to consider as we, and let's use the new year analogy, we're going into 2025, right? What one or two or three things do leaders need to consider in terms of kind of this evolution of HR? What advice would you be giving to kind of leaders as they, I mean, a lot of the kind of forecasting for 2025 is being done or has been done, but actually there's still an opportunity to consider actually how we might approach people, talent strategically in 2025. What would your advice or guidance be for leaders, founders, leadership teams?
Well, I would say really, really, really consider the people that you bring in, because I think the grow at all cost hangover has left us with a lot of highly paid managers who have not had to manage under the theory of constraints. Also a great old book. They've not had to manage with bottlenecks before. They've not had there were no constraints. Everything could be fixed by buying something or buying, like, hiring more people. So you have a pretty big generation that have been managing under that environment, that are probably pretty senior and probably know that they need to go back to some of those business basics. So I mean, you'll see it with me. I'm a big believer in business basics. Being mindful that what was successful in the time of free money is definitely not successful. I think a lot of folks have figured it out already, but
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
still a
Mm-hmm.
reality, and it's a knowledge gap that's very, very, very hard to talk about the higher up you go.
Mm-hmm.
That would be one. Um, the second would, I mean, it's for HR folks specifically, is if you don't understand your business well enough to position yourself to be valuable, I think that it's you need to be asking different questions, right? Like, i- I think that maybe there are people in HR who just maybe don't want to get there, or they, if you're not curious, the higher up you go in HR, it will be very hard to advance. And that means the curiosity to find out the things that you don't know. I think it's quite hard for senior HR folks to have that, because you're in this weird position of, like, being responsible for people and how they perceive you, and it's very, 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 very intense at times. But it's okay to not know, because the only way to know is to start from that point that you don't actually know how to do this strategic piece, and you need help. And there are lots of people who want to help you. Great place, great gateway helper is finance. In HR, finance is your best friend. I always tell finance, I know your future and you know my secrets, because I know what's going to hit the books in weird ways, and they see these weird payouts that went to somebody who left mutually. And, like, we all
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
know. No one's allowed to talk about it, but they kind of know. But finance has really, really, really good insights, and they can teach you things about numbers, and they'll be grateful that you fill out their accrual sheets and are a good partner
Yeah.
to them. And then the last thing would be that point about the mental health piece. Not only as a parent, but as a human being, I think we are entering this time where Gen Z is just so bizarre, and, like, we're all, a lot of folks, and I'm a geriatric millennial, and everybody was complaining about us when we came into the workforce too. And there's, like, balancing this, they're new and full of ideas, as they should be, as every young generation was before them, but that they've also gone through extreme times under extreme circumstances that we've never seen before, while watching everyone's life look perfect on TikTok. And the consequences of this, and for society and for growing workforces, will likely fall to frontline leaders. and we'll have to think of ways to support them.
Amazing. Matthias?
Yeah, I gave this advice in one of my last events as a follow-up. I think, honestly, first of all, everybody try to read about emotional intelligence or study it. Try to figure out how you get there to fully embrace it. I think this is the foundation for a lot of different things for leaders, but particularly for everyone, literally, yeah. Because then the second topic is, which I would highlight, and this would be also for leaders again, is learn to have tough conversations, please, and how to solve your conflicts. I do think that I see so many times in organizations that we're dragging on, we don't want to have these tough conversations because everything was fun. And, we said we couldn't solve a problem. Let's get another person in and let's spend more money on this and so on. I think the time is now, given the circumstances, that if we don't solve our problems, even though this means to have tough conversations and make tough decisions, learn how to get comfortable in doing that. This is really, really important. And my last topic would be, and this is more for the people and TA leaders in the room, is curiosity. Yeah, I think we see this a lot of times when we think about what is an ideal recruiter or what is an ideal TA leader. Curiosity is always important. I mean, if I wouldn't be curious, I would be really bad in my job, because we talked every day with candidates and all of the other people about what they learn, what they do. But this curiosity piece is, especially what Sonita said, really important when it comes to the business. If you're curious and if you ask a leader or even a senior leader in the business, hey, how do you do things? How do you run things? How do you work successfully? How do you measure success even? How do you go, like, people are willing to share. Even these senior leaders, they're willing to
They
share. They're
love
willing
sharing.
actually to, they love sharing about talking about these weird concepts and like engineers. Oh my gosh, right? But then one point you'd be like, look, and now explain it to me like your grandma, right? Please, because half of it I didn't get. So, but this curiosity piece and this openness piece and starting to ask the right questions as well is key.
Nice.
Amazing. I just feel like this conversation could roll on. Trust me. You've dropped so much knowledge in what seems like a really rapid hour, Sonita. Thank you so much for being a guest on Escaping the Echo
Thank you for
Chamber.
a lovely
Amazing.
exchange. Great way to go into a weekend.
Indeed, indeed. And thanks everybody for kind of tuning in. We will be back in 2 weeks' time, I think, is our regular schedule now. But let's say, if you want to connect with Sonita, we're going to drop all of her kind of social contacts in the post alongside this particular episode. But again, Sonita, thank you so much. Amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye bye.